So as the keynote lecture, the topic is the merger of physics and spirituality. And the speaker is Dr. Fedrico Faggin, President, Fedrico and Elvia Faggin Foundation, USA, formerly principal designer and leader at Intel, California, USA. Federico Faggin is a distinguished Italian-American physicist, engineer, inventor, and entrepreneur renowned for his pioneering work in the field of microelectronics. He earned his laurea degree in physics, summa cum laude, from the University of Padua in the year 1965. Faggin's most notable innovation is the design of the world's first commercial microprocessor in Intel uh, in the year 1971. That is, the chip is Intel 4004. At Intel, he led the development of several key microprocessors, including the Intel 8008 and Intel 8080. In 1974, he co-founded Zilog Inc., where he spearheaded the creation of the Z80 microprocessor, a highly successful chip that became widely used in embedded systems and personal computers. Beyond his contributions to microprocessors, he co-founded Signet Technologies in the year 1982, focusing on personal communication systems, and Synaptics in 1986, where he played a key role in advancing touch technology and artificial neural networks. Throughout his career, he has received numerous awards and honors in recognition of his exceptional contributions to technology and science. In 2009, he was awarded the National Medal of Technology and Innovation by President Barack Obama. He has also been honored with the Marconi International Fellowship Award, the Kyoto Prize, and the IEEE W. Wallace McDowell Award, among others. He is a fellow of the Computer History Museum and has received honorary degrees from several prestigious institutions. In 2011, he founded the Fedrico and Elvia Faggin Foundation, dedicated to supporting the scientific study of consciousness. Reflecting his deep interest in exploring the intersection of technology and human understanding. Federico Faggin's legacy is marked by his innovative spirit, brilliance, technical brilliance, and profound influence on the development of modern computing and electronics. His extensive contributions to technology and science had made him a prominent figure in the field of microelectronics and beyond.
So today, I will talk about the merger of physics and spirituality, which is a subject that has been interesting me for the last 35, 37 years. May I have the next slide, please? You have heard my background, and in the late 80s, I was working with artificial neural networks as synaptics. I was studying neuroscience and biology. And I asked myself, how come that these books of neuroscience never mention consciousness? They talk about electrical signals in the brain, biochemical signals, and so on. But what happened to the feelings? I know because I feel. So how can we transform electrical signals into sensations and feelings? That problem was actually very strong with me, and I wanted to really understand. And in 1990, I had an awakening experience that changed completely my perspective about the nature of consciousness and the nature of reality. I experienced myself as both the observer and the observed. I was the world observing itself with my point of view. And that completely threw me off. How can that be? How can that be possible? That started a journey that for 20 years placed me into a position where I wanted to study consciousness experientially. And after about 20 years, I reached the conclusion that consciousness and free will, because the two must work together, must be fundamental phenomena. They cannot emerge from the brain, like scientists are saying. So I decided to leave everything that I was doing to dedicate myself to the study of consciousness and trying to bring together what I knew about physics to explanation of this foundational phenomenon. The major result of this work is that in the last few years, I have now a new theory of physics and spirituality that changes very little, in fact, almost nothing of physics, but explains why and what is consciousness, and changes our worldview from materialism to a form of scientific idealism that is based on the properties of quantum physics. Next slide, please. I call NUSIM this new discipline that merges physics and spirituality, starting with one defined as all that exists. So one is a unified field out of which all the other fields emerge, and free will and consciousness are therefore properties of one. Mathematics cannot explain consciousness because mathematics is created by consciousness. And also free will, we know, must be a non-algorithmic random event when looked from the outside. From within the conscious agent, it is, of course, a free will decision. So consciousness and free will are primitives that cannot be explained by something that does not have those properties. How can you explain consciousness with matter that is unconscious? How can you explain free will with matter that follows laws? We have to start, therefore, with the postulate of being. Next slide, please. It is a simple postulate. One, the totality of what exists, is dynamic, holistic, and wants to know itself. Dynamic and holistic are properties of quantum physics. Quantum physics already is saying that the universe is dynamic and holistic, and it is a single field, even though physics has not joined quantum physics and general relativity into a single field yet, but everybody agrees there would have to be a single field. So dynamic means that one is never the same instant after instant. Even space is never the same instant after instant because we know that it is inflating. Holistic means that one is not made of separable parts. In other words, everything is interconnected with one. That's what entanglement is teaching us. Free will is the capacity of one to direct its own self-knowing in this understanding. And consciousness, therefore, is the capacity of one to know itself. I also call potential knowledge the knowing that one does not yet know. In other words, one is not omniscient. It has to learn. It has to essentially know itself by creating monads, creating entities that know themselves. I call actual knowledge the knowing that one has realized. Next slide, please. So when one knows itself for the first time with a certain point of view, with a certain perspective or direction, one brings into existence a part whole of itself, which is like the monads of Leibniz. I call it monads or consciousness unit. Since one is holistic, it cannot know just a part of itself. It must know the totality of itself with that perspective. It's like a direction in which one looks at itself. Thus, the monad must have the whole potentiality of one. And since there are many monads, the monad has to be a part whole, a part that contains the potentiality of the whole. And since the self-knowing of one brings into existence what it knows, knowing and existing are two aspects of the same thing. Next slide, please. The perspective with which one has known itself is the identity of the monad. That's a definition of identity. Identity is a property that is unique and eternal with which the monad can in turn know itself. One knows itself through the monads and the combination of monads that are creating fields. This is the beginning of life. Life, in other words, one begets monads. Life incorporates a holographic principle. In other words, each part contains the whole, and no part is separate from the whole. This is also true for our organism, for our body. Each cell of our body has the genome of the entire organism, of the egg that created the entire organism. So we are made of parts whole. A computer is not made of parts whole. A computer is made of transistors, which are switches. A switch knows nothing about the system of which it is part, has no possible knowledge. Like one, the monads are dynamic, holistic, they have free will, consciousness, and want to know themselves through the unique identity with which they were generated. So monads are elementary fields that can also generate other monads and combine with each other to create a hierarchy of conscious fields. And the property of consciousness and free will can then explain why quantum physics must have these strange properties that it has. In other words, starting with the postulate that consciousness and free will exist, we can now explain why quantum physics must be crazy, like many call it. Next slide, please. So we know because we feel, and we feel what we know in our consciousness. Feelings are called qualia and have the very simple properties. The qualia are a definite state that does not exist in space-time. Qualia are private because they cannot be reproduced, and they can only be known by the field, which is by the entity that is in that state. And also we can only communicate, qualia can only be communicated in a small portion, because what we feel is much, much more than what we can say about what we feel with symbols, with words, which are shareable information. So the postulated existence of qualia requires that the quantum state of a field, which is a theoretical construct, has the same properties of qualia, because if consciousness exists and qualia is the way in which consciousness knows itself, then physics must have some properties like that. In fact, the quantum state is a definite state because it is a unit vector in an n-dimensional complex space. The quantum state cannot be cloned, cannot be reproduced, is private, exactly like our experience. And the maximum information that we can extract from a quantum state is a bit per quantum bit, and the bits are entangled. So it's a very small amount of information that we can have or we can share about what we feel. Next slide, please. So one more thing is that the collapse of the wave function is a non-algorithmic random event that has no explanation within physics. We have to take it or leave it. That's the way it is. No one has been able to explain why it exists. In this explanation, the collapse of the wave function is simply a decision of free will of the field. It is the field that decides among the many possibilities that can be computed with quantum physics, the actuality that will manifest. And of course, in the past, since free will without consciousness doesn't make any sense, physicists could not attribute the collapse of the wave function to free will. But now that we know, that we have shown that consciousness exists in the field because qualia exists, and the only way to explain qualia is to have quantum states that have those properties. However, having shown that the quantum fields are conscious, the collapse of the wave functions cannot be interpreted as free will decision of the field. I'm repeating what I just said. We can now say that the quantum fields have consciousness and free will, thus explaining the necessity for the existence of the absurd property of quantum physics. Next slide, please. So, but then why do we need classical physics? We need it because we need to see, since we cannot transform, we cannot move what we feel, convey that to another. We have to use symbols to do that, symbols that are shareable, and we can only have symbols, less information than what we feel. Since the fields are parts whole and want to know themselves, to do so, they must communicate with each other. In other words, I perceive the other like myself, but I cannot transfer what I feel. So I know I want to communicate, but I cannot transfer what I feel. And the other is the same. So we have to resort to some symbols. Therefore, qualia must be converted into shareable symbols. And I have called these live symbols, beginning with the virtual and elementary particles in space-time. Those are the symbols that fields can use to communicate with each other, starting at the very beginning of the universe. Live symbols are excited states of the field, inseparable from the field. They share the properties of the field, and they may appear and disappear from the field, just like waves in the sea. Symbols like an electron, for example, are not particles that are separate from the field. There are states of the field, like waves in the sea. So here we have an important point, because in reality, the reality is holistic, because even the live symbols are not separate from the field. They are states of the field. Live symbols can be used by the fields to communicate their meaning, just like we use spoken words to do so. Excuse me a sec. Live symbols combine quantumly into nucleons, atoms, molecules, etc., forming a hierarchy of quantum structures in space-time. We know that, and that's how, how we those symbols are those composite symbols are the information of composite fields. Next slide, please. So many live symbols can also combine incoherently, forming long-lasting objects in space-time that behave deterministically. That's classical physics. And objects can be used as classical symbols appropriate for the long-term memory of live symbols. Classical symbols are like written words. In other words, we also use dynamic symbols. What I'm doing right now, speaking to you, these are dynamic symbols. I can put a lot of more information in the words that I speak, because I modulate the sound that when I write the same words. The same thing happens here. Live symbols are dynamic symbols. They come and they go. They have properties. They have rich properties. An electron is both information, energy, and matter, and they cannot be separated. So you can see that we have the need for a type of information which has not been recognized, which is the information that we can use to actually explain living cells. Living cells are quantum classical systems that work with the combination of classical and quantum laws. And classical symbols, on the other hand, are like written words. They are static. Those symbols remains. They are, even if they move, they're still, the symbols are cannot carry the level of information intrinsically that a live symbols can. Since a quantum state is dynamic and cannot be reproduced, the long-term memory of the experience must use either classical symbols or special quantum classical symbols like DNA, for example. The nucleotides of DNA are just like letters of the alphabets. They are atoms, but they can serve the purpose of a letter of the alphabet. But the DNA or the RNA move around. They have quantum properties. They interact quantumly with the molecules that are around them. So we cannot separate the quantumness from the classical. Live quantum classical and classical symbols in space-time constitute the communication and memory symbols that enable the fields to increase their past self-knowing. The need for memorizing the self-knowing, the experience, is fundamental because the quantum state has a very short duration, and it moves, and it is dynamic. It keeps on moving. So unless you put into memory, long-term memory, the essence of the experience, the meaning of the experience, then you will not remember. You will be like someone with Alzheimer's. He only knows what the present. Next slide, please. Now, this is a framework that I have created to explain now the nature of reality viewed through this lens. So far, I have described two worlds: the inner, private, subjective, and semantic space, which is the space of meaning, which I call C-space, for consciousness space. That's the space where I feel. It is a vaster space. It is not space-time. That's where I know. Each one of us knows in this space that we perceive as our interiority. Excuse me. So C-space. Now, there is another space called I-space, which is the outer, public, and objective symbolic space of the live symbols and their combination. So those are two fundamental spaces. And I already said C-space is the vaster semantic reality that contains the elementary conscious fields with free will, the monads and their combinations, which are called seities. And C-space is multidimensional and is not characterized by real numbers. Qualia are not numbers. Qualia can only be represented by quantum states which require n dimensions and complex dimensions. But the representation of qualia is not qualia the way I perceive it. I know qualia by experiencing it. So the ontology is in the experience, not in the mathematics that can only at most represent what I experience. I know because I experience. So I-space is the symbolic space of live symbols in space-time that includes quantum classical and classical symbols. These are all public, they're all shareable symbols, and classical symbols behave deterministically, forming classical physics, and may be represented with real numbers. You can also make simulations of classical physics. You cannot easily simulate quantum physics because of the problem that is free will. So you may simulate a particular event, but you cannot simulate, for example, a living cell. Simple live symbols interact by following quantum physics, and quantum classical symbols follow laws that combine classical and quantum physics. Next slide, please. So through their repeated communications, two seities, A and B, can achieve the same meaning, a portion of the same meaning due to that communication. We can then say that they understand each other. In other words, a portion of the A state resonates with a portion of B state. As their joint meaning expands, The A symbols and the B symbols that are used to represent the same meaning must integrate in a growing number of stable states toward the creation of a symbol that combines the two. When the maximum joint meaning has been achieved, a new stable joint symbol is produced concurrently with the birth of the combination of A and B, a new satiety of a higher level of hierarchy. For example, when the satiety electron and the satiety proton find all the meaning they have in common, they give birth to the satiety hydrogen, whose identity symbol is the hydrogen atom. The hydrogen atom does not have the properties that are the sum of the properties of the electron and the proton. The hydrogen atom has properties that are completely different and much more sophisticated than the sum of the properties of the two particles that have the two states that combine. So this is what quantum physics does. Quantum physics does not give you, when you do a superposition of states, you don't have the sum of the properties of the states that you superpose. You have new properties, creative properties. This does not happen with classical physics. In classical physics, the property of the whole is the sum of the property of the parts. That's reductionism. In a holistic system like we are talking about, like the universe that we are talking about, this is not true. The satiety hydrogen has a new identity, and it now directs its self-knowing from the perspective of the combination of the points of view of A and B. Next slide, please. After much evolution, the satieties collectively develop a special kind of symbol capable of self-reproduction, a living cell. A living cell is the culmination of the self-knowing of a large number of satieties communicating with each other that have figured out that they can actually reproduce life within the symbolic reality. Now, this symbol can be partially controlled by a satiety, and the satiety can also understand the live information within a cell. They created it. It was their own creation over a long time, because it was not a creation in the sense that, of the creationist that creates a cell from nothing. It is an evolution. The evolution, however, is the evolution of the self-knowing of the satieties. It's not the evolution due to randomness and the selection of random events. At some point, multicellular organisms develop, and eventually plants, animals, Homo sapiens, come into being as their knowing, the knowing of these satieties that created these symbols, grows. In other words, the more satieties know, the more sophisticated the symbols to express what they know must be. A satiety can use an animal as a drone by experiencing the live information produced by its cells to understand the situation in which the animal finds itself. The satiety can then in turn send live symbols to the animal cells for the purpose of controlling the animal behavior. In this manner, the satiety experiences the life of the animal from the animal's point of view and may identify with the animal to the point of forgetting its own identity. When that happens, an ego is being created, a portion of a satiety that believes to be the body. Note that the conscious experience of the animal belongs to the field and not to the animal. Next slide, please. Through the animals they control, satieties can now interact with each other and with the environment in which the animals exist for the purpose of knowing their own intentions, biases, and capacities. So the physical reality experienced by the satiety is not I-space. It is only that portion of I-space that has been sensed and processed by the sensory brain system of the animal transform into live information in the animal cells, and further transform into qualia experience by the satiety. I call this experience P-space for physical space. This P-space is a construction done by the organism. It is almost a virtual reality. We think that we live in this world that we believe is the reality, but in fact, by having the same brain, the same sensory systems, we all construct a similar world, and we believe that that is the world. No, here in this space where we don't see anything, there is huge amount of other things. For example, here where I don't see anything, if I, instead of eyes, I had cell phones that can synchronize to different frequencies, I could listen in to 10,000 conversations which are going on right now here where I don't see anything. So when the animal body dies, the satiety that is identified with the body wakes up to the vaster reality in which it always existed, realizing that it was briefly hypnotized. The satiety can now remember its forgotten experiences in previous lives. Next slide, please. So what are the major consequences of this theory? This theory changes completely our understanding of reality, evolution, who are we, and so on. It's a foundational transformation if we believe it, if we believe the postulate. The postulate, by the way, is self-evident because I'm saying that consciousness and free will exist, and every one of us knows that he is conscious or she is conscious, and that we have a modicum of free will. So there is nothing more self-evident than that. Major consequence, the ontology is not within the matter energy in space-time. This changes completely. Right now we believe in the sort of the scientist, because it's a worldview which is a materialist worldview, where we start with matter energy in space-time. Well, matter energy in space-time must be now understood in terms of knowing, self-knowing. What is space in terms of self-knowing? An hypothesis, for example, that space is actually the memory of the experience of these satiety. So within the shareable, the ontology is not in the what we believe, but which are the shareable symbols. It is instead in the self-knowing of one, the qualia, comprehension, and meaning that exist in this satiety. Qualia, by the way, is just the way we know, but qualia are the bringers of meaning, and the comprehension is the process that goes from qualia to meaning. What we want to communicate is not the way we feel, but the meaning of what we feel. So the symbols that we use are trying to capture already something which is processed within the field. Qualia is the entry point into this vaster reality, and that allows us to know ourselves, but we need to then get the meaning of what we feel. Life is fundamental and is essentially based on cooperation, not competition. Competition emerges only as special case of cooperation. So life is basically a cooperative venture. It is the culmination of a major self-knowing by a large group of entities that have cooperated to know each other. And so the principle of survival of the fittest, that is a competitive only principle, is out. How can you get more with less? The idea of emergent properties that we have, that generally are emergent property of classical systems, which from classical system, nothing can emerge that is more than the sum of the parts. So how can we get more from less? Only quantum reality has the property that there is the sum of the parts, which is not really a sum, it's a superposition of the parts, gives you more than the sum, gives you more of the properties of the parts. And we see that in chemistry every day. Now, the evolution of the universe is not the result of random variation and selection. It is due to the ever-growing self-knowing of the seities. We are not our body. A seity does not perish when the body it controls dies. Bodies are quantum classical machines that are much more sophisticated than computer. I mentioned that earlier when I was saying that the parts of the body are parts whole, where the parts of a computer are extremely simple parts. Next slide, please. So we are all parts whole of one. Thus, to know myself, I need to know the others like myself. I cannot, in order to, because the other is, in a sense, a part of me. I need to know the other to know myself. And this communication is foundational. And that's, of course, is what all the interaction of symbols in space and time is just what it appears, is the game of symbols that interact, that, however, are the surface phenomena of self-knowing that goes on behind the scene, behind the veil of space and time. So we are all connected from within by one. Therefore, the good or ill that we do to others, we do to ourselves. Knowing, love, and life are the foundations of existence. Thank you.